All right, guys. Today we're going to do some trigger testing. I'm going to use my handy dandy trigger dyno here. It's just a load cell with a little finger that I attached to it. It's in a Z configuration, so it doesn't put too much torque on it. It's on a linear actuator. There's a stepper motor. It basically moves in 1/1000th of an inch increments, so we can get a ton of readings. It's accurate to about within, I believe, 3/100ths of an ounce, so it's pretty accurate. So I'm going to get a baseline. This is well, it's not stock, but all of the trigger internals and all the slide internals, with the exception of the barrel, are stock. So I'm on a P80 frame. The reason I'm using a P80 is I've got a Picatinny rail. This rail is a little bit more rigid than you would on a factory Glock, and also it's a lot easier to mount in my little mount here. So while it may not give an exact Gen 3 Glock trigger pull, if you test 10 different Glocks, you're going to get 10 different trigger pulls anyway, so this will at least give us consistency. So, got a magazine with some dummy rounds in it. Always have a couple dummy rounds, put pressure on the slide to give you a good trigger pull that's consistent. Lock it in. Another great thing about the Polymer 80 is I don't care if I mess the frame up, because, well, I can always make another one. All right, so let me get my finger set right in front of the safety blade. Stock trigger. All right, so I've set the limit to 8 pounds. Let's start. So what I can do in the program is it'll ask me for a weight limit. So I've set it to 8 pounds, so it should break before 8 pounds, and then it'll press back into the back of the trigger guard. When it reaches that 8-pound threshold, it stops. I can reset the slide, and then hit the button, and it'll bring it back, and so I can measure the reset, and it'll take it back to the original start position. So then when I change the parts, put the gun back in, everything should be pretty much where it started. It'll usually be within about 1/1000th of an inch when I put everything back in. So what I've got to test are the Apex Ultimate Safety Plunger with the reduced power spring. This is a 6-pound competition spring from Glockmeister. Lots of places sell them. I've got a 5-pound Wolff striker spring, 4.5-pound Wolff striker spring. After I do all those parts, then I'm going to do the triggers. The way I figure it, most people aren't just going to throw one of these triggers in, they're probably going to change some of the other parts too while they're at it. So I've got an Overwatch Precision Falx, an Agency, and an Apex. And this is also on loan from Tyler at Modern Outdoor Adventures. So for Glock parts, hit that guy up. He's a good dude. All right, there's the brake. Now we're doing over travel. Lots of over travel. All right, let's reset. So this is going to be with the Apex plunger. So now for the trigger spring. put in the Wolff 5-pound spray. Okay. Now the 4.5. So the really sucky part is I'm using my phone to record this, so while I'm waiting I can't look at my phone. I have to just sit here and listen to the motor tick away. So, you're welcome, Internet. Yeah, this thing takes about 1,000 readings in each direction, so a lot of data to go through, or a lot of data points. All right, let's do the, let go. Let's do the apex first. I might do connectors in the future, but there's so many connectors out there. Figured maybe start with triggers, narrow down to one trigger, and then do connectors, maybe in a later video if you guys really want. So if you want connectors, let me know which ones you want me to try. If I have them on hand, I'll use them. I'll see what I can borrow, and if I have to, if they're super popular, maybe I'll buy one. All right. So here's the Apex on loan from Modern Outdoor Adventures. It's getting a little warm, but it's not overheating. The original motor I was using was burning up the controllers in about 10 seconds, so I had to switch some motors around. So initially I had a 5 kilogram load cell. Wasn't enough, and it just wasn't going to cut it. So I went to a 10 kilogram. This was the original finger to pull triggers, and because it was rounded, it would roll as it would pull the trigger and give me false readings. Also, this diameter was too big. The new one is thinner, and it's got a Delrin, basically a bearing that spins around so it doesn't drag. Reset. This was the original motor. This one draws about 1.5 amps, and it was burning these out like crazy. So replaced it with this motor, which was 350 milliamps. It wasn't powerful enough. After about a 4.5, 5-pound trigger, the motor wouldn't have enough torque, so that went away. Got rid of that. This controller is good to 4 amps, and this is a 1 amp motor, and it's 400 steps per revolution on a 5mm ball screw. So that gives me 0.0125 millimeters of resolution, which is just under 1,000th of an inch. figured that most reviews of triggers are just reviews. Someone will take a reading as far as like a weight, and then they'll tell you it was crisp, or it feels like a 1911, or it has a crisp break or a smooth reset, and they all pretty much sound the same. It doesn't really tell me anything. So what I'm hoping this will do is I took the baseline stock trigger readings. So if you feel like your stock trigger can be improved in a certain way, and you can look at the graph and go, oh, hey, that Overwatch, I like the way that the resistance curve moves up, or I like the way the agency, I like the way the reset looks. Hopefully it'll help you make a more informed decision on what trigger to get, instead of just, you know, some gun bunny on Instagram says this is the best trigger because she's sponsored by that company. That's not really, it's not really as useful. So I know most people won't geek out about triggers the way I do, but if you like data and metrics and actually measuring performance, then hopefully you'll find this interesting. You can see how much further back that starts. That's a lot of dead trigger pull I'm going to have to work for. Alright, so my camera decided to die just as I started the agency trigger, so I had to plug it back in. I'm just going to do it again. Oh, and one thing about the agency trigger, they used to come with a polished 3.5 pound connector. Apparently they don't anymore. So that's one reason why I'm still using the factory connector with it. The other reason is it wouldn't be fair to put their connector in against, say, you know, one of these other triggers by keeping the connector the same. That way everything's on a level playing field. So we can really just see what the trigger is doing. Most people are going to swap connectors to whatever their favorites are anyway. So. Alright, I'm going to enter all this into spreadsheet form. I'll turn on my screen grabber software and we'll start talking through these triggers. Okay, here's all the data. Instead of just giving you a bunch of numbers on spreadsheets, I just grabbed everything out in Excel. So let's just kind of go over this real quick. So this is the stock trigger. Looks like it's breaking around 7 pounds. Keep in mind that the way I had the gun positioned in my rig, it was pulling the trigger a little bit higher on the trigger guard than usual, than where I would normally pull it. So where I feel it in my fingers is probably a pound lower than what we're seeing here. But by pulling up high, I get a taller reading and I have much more dramatic curves. So it makes it easier to see sort of the deltas between the different parts. So keep that in mind. So the first millimeter is just dead space. There's just air between the finger and the trigger guard. This is the trigger safety blade being retracted into the trigger, and then you've got the initial ramp up. So now you're actually pulling against the striker spring. This little bump here is where the trigger bar is lifting the firing pin block up into the slide. We got some roughness here. Here's the wall. So when you see this sharp corner here, that's that wall feeling. Obviously a shallower connector, like a minus connector, this is going to be a lot shallower, so you may not even feel it as well, which is why sometimes people don't like that mushy feeling of a minus connector. You've got the force loading up, and then you've got this little hitch here. That could be just some point of friction. And then here's our brake, and in fact, almost no over travel. What I think is happening is because it's a plastic trigger, the plastic trigger is hitting the back of the trigger guard, and then this is just flex. So the finger is just pulling and basically just bending the trigger until it reaches that 8-pound limit that we set, where it quits. Because when I go to reset, it looks like it's basically going from infinite to about 2.5 pounds, and then it starts dropping off, and about 3 millimeters forward till you hit the snap of the reset. So that's the stock trigger. So let's throw the apex plunger in. Alright, so our reset looks about the same. It's just shifted a little bit. Maybe the gun moved in the mount or something. You can see this shallow curve here, and it looks like when it's starting to engage the plunger, because the plunger is rounded and a little bit lighter, you're getting a little bit less friction across the board, which is probably why everything's a little bit lighter. That hitch is still there, but it's less pronounced. The hitch right before the brake is still there, but it's less pronounced. And then we've got our brake. Over travel is the same, reset's about the same. So a little bit smoother, maybe 2 ounces of reduction here. All right, the 6-pound trigger spring. So you've got a pretty big drop in pre-travel weight. You can see the difference here. But as the trigger moves to the rear, that difference is getting smaller. The gap gets narrower and narrower until we get to the brake, and it's basically nothing. It looks like it's even a little bit heavier, but it's cleaner. And it took out that little hitch. It seems to have just kind of flattened out here. So why isn't it lighter? So the reason for that is the trigger spring is under tension. So the further forward the trigger is, the more tension it can provide. So it can fight the striker with more force, which is why you've got a bigger gap here. As you pull the trigger to the rear, the trigger spring is getting more and more relaxed until it reaches a point where it's barely pulling. So now it's not helping you at all, which is why you've got a bigger gap here than back here. So it did help smooth out the movement, but the overall brake weight didn't change. So that's pretty interesting. Alright, so I'm going to switch to just the 6-pound, since that's what we used for here on out. And let's look at the Wolff 5-pound. Oops, hold on, let me hit apply this time. Alright, so this is interesting. The supposedly lighter Wolff spring is actually a few ounces heavier than the factory spring. And I think the reason for that is the Wolff spring is brand new. It hasn't been broken in at all. It literally just came out of the package. And when you saw me put it in, I didn't dry fire it at all, didn't wear it in. And it looks like the factory spring, I put a couple hundred dry fire rounds through it just to kind of break it in. But because I didn't do that with the Wolff spring, it looks like it hasn't taken a set yet. So when you look at the reset weights are almost identical. So it looks like the 5-pound spring just needed to break in. Unfortunately, I don't have time to break it in, and I don't want to go through all these triggers again because it took me about 2 hours. It's about 11:30 at night right now, so apologies, but it looks like that's just data that we can't really use right now. Now if I pull in the 4.5-pound spring, you can see that it drops about a pound, and there's the reset dropping.
Everything else looks about the same. So if you extrapolate the 5.5 pound spring, more than likely that line would be somewhere around here. Now the 4.5 pound spring wasn't broken in either, but I think just because of the fact that it's so much lighter, it just gives you more of a difference. But yeah, well, that's about the same. So gonna go ahead and use the 4.5 pound reading as our baseline when we compare the aftermarket triggers. So let's start with the apex. So look at that. The apex, everything is pushed forward in the trigger guard about 2.5 millimeters. You can see the overall shape is about the same as far as the slope of these lines. And it looks like it's increased the reset. So the reset force is higher than factory, but the overall pull weight is still about the same. So that's interesting. So that must have something to do with the flat face and just the way it's pulling. And it looks like where my finger was starting at 0 was actually already pressing on the trigger safety blade. So it looks like the trigger just sits at rest about 2 or 3 millimeters further forward than the factory trigger, so you've got more trigger reach, and everything's just been pushed forward. And it looks like they've compressed everything slightly, so there might be a slight geometry change. So if you have really long fingers, or like to press with like the very tip of your finger, you might find the apex more your style. Yeah. It looks like, again, very little over travel and about 2.5 millimeters. So it looks like it shortened the reset just a little bit. All right, let's go to the Overwatch Precision Falx. Falx, is that how you say it? All right, so this one's quite the opposite. The Overwatch Precision has a pre-travel reduction built into it. So the trigger doesn't start, you don't even touch the trigger until about 5 millimeters further back of the factory. So your finger is going to be about 0.5 centimeter back. Looks like there is the initial pull of the safety blade and the trigger. You've got this big jump. It looks like as soon as you start pulling the trigger, it's beginning to deactivate the firing pin block. And there's your ramp. It looks like the weight increased a little bit. That may be because of the curve of the trigger and just the way my machine is pulling on it. Alright, so we got a decent break, a little bit of over travel, and looks like about 2 millimeters of reset distance. So it looks like they've shortened everything up a little bit, and that makes sense. If you're going to shorten the travel, you're going to have to increase the weight. That's leverage. If you were to increase the overall travel, then you would decrease the weight. So it looks like they're sacrificing a little bit of weight for a slightly shorter trigger. All right, let's pull up the agency. All right, so there's the agency. Looks like it's sitting kind of in between the Apex and the Overwatch as far as weight. It's not as far back as the Overwatch as far as where it ends in the trigger guard and curving this line here, but it looks like it starts even further back. So there's an even more aggressive pre-travel reduction. Oh, I'm sorry, guys, my mouth is super dry right now. But yeah, I mean, it starts way back in the trigger guard, and then you've got this curve here. And I think what's happening is the trigger bar is deactivating the firing pin block, and the trigger bar, the tab that actually engages the firing pin block is shaped kind of like that. They recut it in kind of a crescent shape instead of a flat line, and I think that's what's happening. You're getting this gradual and then sudden ramp up of force because it's that curved surface pushing up on the firing pin block. And then there's the wall, and then it just comes up. What is this? It's the apex. That's the reset. Oh, sorry, that's the apex trigger. Because I forgot everything got moved for the 4. There's the agency. All right, so there's the agency reset. So 1, 2, again, about 2.5 millimeters of reset, and still minimal over travel. So, personally, I like the agency trigger, but I use it with a Ghost 4.5 pound edge connector, or maybe it's a 3.5 pound edge, whatever. It's the Ghost edge connector. So that's my favorite combination. I do run the Falx triggers in my G43 because the trigger reach is already so short that I'm using the first joint of my finger, so the Falx feels a little bit better. I've never really been a fan of the Apex, I think because it sits so far forward. Something about that just doesn't work for me. Although I know a lot of people really like them, and I can see why. I mean, if you pull with the very tip of your finger, or if you've got maybe large hands, or just want to have a longer trigger reach, I can see where the Apex can really help out there. So, yeah, there's the data on the triggers. Obviously there's a lot more aftermarket triggers out there. There's a lot of connectors out there. There's no way I can test them all. I don't have the money, for one thing, to just go buying all of them. But if this helps you, great. If there's something else you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. Maybe I can try to work it out. Maybe I can borrow some parts. I'd love to be able to test every gun and every part out there, but I just don't have the time or energy or money to do it. So, yeah. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Oh, I'm going to put this spreadsheet, I'm going to put all the data in Google Docs and put a link to it below so you guys can look at the data and figure out what you want to do with it. So, anyway, I am tired. I am ready for bed. So, see you guys later.